Great. Well, I want to start by thanking IPPSR. Thank you to Matt and Anne-Marie for inviting me to come out today. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come think with us about the critical topic of early education for children at risk. I'm going to be talking, give you a broad overview of what we know about the benefits of early childhood education, but what I'll really want to focus on is thinking about how we can better support the early childhood workforce and the institutions that in particular provide public pre-K for 4-year-old children in the state of Michigan. So that'll be the focus of my talk today. So like Anne-Marie said, I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education at MSU, and my research focuses on early childhood policy and specifically pre-kindergarten policy. I look at the implications of policy for teachers, families, and children. So today I'll talk a bit about state-funded pre-kindergarten and what I've learned from my research about how pre-K policy affects the early childhood workforce. I'll start by setting the context, both nationally and in Michigan. As I'm sure everyone in this room is aware, there's ample evidence that high-quality early childhood education makes a difference for young children, particularly those considered at risk. Given evidence of the effectiveness of early childhood education, there's been increased investment in state-funded pre-kindergarten over the past decade or so. As you can see here, if you can see those in the back, this chart is showing us how that the percentage of 4-year-olds enrolled in public pre-kindergarten in the U.S. has increased from 14 to 32% between 2002 and 2016. So 32% might not sound like a lot, but we're kind of slowly but surely providing more opportunities for children to attend state-funded pre-K. And people in the early childhood world get pretty excited about 32% enrolled nationally, although there's clearly still more room to grow. So when it comes to pre-K access, and that's what this map shows us, the white states have no public pre-K, and then as you move to the darker green states, they have a higher percentage of the population of 4-year-olds enrolled in pre-K. So Michigan is in about the middle of the pack, with 34% of 4-year-olds enrolled in the Great Start Readiness Program, or GSRP. But the state has recently invested considerable resources in public pre-K, called GSRP, in Michigan. So I think from fiscal year 2013 to 14, there was a 37% increase in funding for GSRP. So clearly the state is committed to public pre-K. And given that we know that Michigan is investing resources in GSRP, I want to help us think about one way to ensure the program is as effective as possible by creating policies that support public pre-K teachers and the institutions where pre-K is provided. I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with GSRP, but I wanted to provide just a brief overview. So GSRP is a targeted program, which means that there are eligibility requirements based on income and other risk factors. Nationally, GSRP does pretty well. It meets 9 of the 10 quality standards set forth by the National Institute for Early Education Research, and it ranks 15th in the nation for access and 15th for state spending. GSRP is implemented in public school and community sites, which is important for the next part of the conversation or of the discussion. So now I want to think about those school community partnerships. Pre-K partnerships bring schools and community providers such as childcares, preschools, Head Start programs together to provide public pre-K. Partnerships are actually mandated in the state of Michigan. 30% of GSRP slots in each ISD must be provided in community-based organizations. There are many benefits to this arrangement. Schools and providers are able to leverage resources and expertise to ensure quality program access, as well as alignment across grade levels. But I also want to think today about some of the challenges that arise when you bring schools and community providers together to implement pre-K policy. And that's not to say, I'm not saying we shouldn't have these community partnerships, but I'm just saying that there are some unforeseen challenges, and I want to think about the ways that policy can better address those challenges that arise when you bring these two very different sectors together to benefit young children. So the first thing to recognize is that the early childhood ecosystem is a relatively fragile one. Many childcare providers in preschools operate pretty close to the margin. As one preschool director in my research noted, our budget is so tight it squeaks. In my research, I found that although the logic was that public pre-K would be a boon to early childhood providers, providing this constant stream of state funding, the economic impact of pre-K was not always positive. First, the presence of public pre-K in a community may make some community providers vulnerable. Those providers that are not qualified, so in Michigan that would be, I think, achieving a 3-star rating on the quality rating scale, or the Great Start to Quality scale. Wendy can probably correct me if I'm wrong about that. So those providers that don't qualify to provide public pre-K can have their revenue stream significantly affected if they start losing 4-year-olds from their program to public pre-K. Most childcare providers depend on older children to offset the high cost of infant and toddler care. So public pre-K in a community can actually threaten those childcare providers' vulnerability if they start losing their 4-year-olds. For sites that do provide public pre-K, the per pupil funding they receive may not be enough to cover the costs of providing the program. I found that many providers were stuck in a catch-22. If they did not participate in pre-K, their viability was threatened, but if they did participate, they found it difficult to cover the costs of operating their program. So you're kind of stuck in the middle, trying to figure out the best way forward and come up with some creative solutions to meet any budget shortfalls. I also found that in some cases, school budgets were affected by the introduction of public pre-K classrooms into elementary schools. Because additional funds for special education and services for English language learners were not allocated, schools had to spread existing resources to cover new pre-K students in the building. Another challenge that institutions face when they're part of these pre-K partnerships is that often pre-K policies are really designed with public schools and not community providers in mind. As a result, community childcare sites and preschools struggle to meet some policy requirements because they don't operate at the same scale or have access to the same resources that public schools do. For example, in my research, the district that I studied had a requirement that substitute teachers in pre-K hold a bachelor's degree and a teaching license. Although community providers had access to the school district's substitute teacher pool, they simply could not pay substitute teachers at the same rate as the school district. So I think one substitute teacher signed up to serve at childcare sites in pre-K. So in most cases, moving a teacher from another room at the childcare site, for example, and into the pre-K classroom was not an option because few teachers in the building possessed the credentials needed to teach pre-K. As a result, these providers had to come up with creative ways to find qualified substitute teachers, including asking parents who had those credentials to come volunteer or substitute teach for lower pay than they would get in the public schools. This and other difficulties could have been addressed through policy had the school district been more attuned to the particular nature and needs of childcare. Finally, implementing pre-K across a range of sites can make existing inequalities across the early childhood workforce visible. In the school district where I conducted my research, there were no regulations for pre-K teacher pay. Because of this, there were vast discrepancies across sites where pre-K was implemented. Teachers with the exact same credentials could be earning anywhere from $14.25 an hour with limited or no benefits at a child care site to $52,000 annually with health and retirement benefits at a public elementary school just down the road. You can imagine what happens in this situation. Teachers were very aware of the compensation differences, and the effect was to create a constant churn of teachers out of childcare and into public schools. We know that teacher turnover negatively affects program quality. So these pay disparities actually undermine the quality of the pre-K program as a whole by creating an incentive for teachers in community sites to get out kind of get out of childcare and into the public schools. At the end of the year when I conducted my research, the 2 focal teachers I was following who worked in childcare sites had found new jobs in public schools and not in pre-K classrooms. Beyond pay, there were also significant differences in pre-K teachers' working conditions across community and public school sites. At childcare sites, teachers spent most of the day responsible for children with little release time for planning or professional development that we know contributes to the quality of programming. In contrast, public school pre-K teachers had a clearly defined workday and built-in time for planning and professional development. Finally, requirements like a bachelor's degree or teaching license pose a challenge for the workforce. Many early childhood teachers who work in childcare sites with 3- and 4-year-olds do not possess these credentials. While these teachers may wish to join the public pre-K teaching force, financial and time constraints may prevent them from doing so, shutting them out of an opportunity for career advancement through public pre-K. So I'll end here with just a few recommendations for how policy can make pre-K a better place for teachers and community providers. And again, I want to stress that I think school community partnerships can be really beneficial to children, to families, and to teachers, but only if we do it right and if we provide the right supports to early childhood teachers and particularly to community-based organizations who are implementing pre-K. First, there's a need to account for and adapt to the economic impact of pre-K. This requires understanding the way the presence of pre-K affects the range of sites where it's provided, and just to make things more complicated, the way it affects those sites differently. It's not the same for each provider. Second, there's a need to provide community partners with additional support they may need to meet policy mandates. This requires understanding the nature of childcare and the particular challenges community providers may face in implementing policy. Finally, policy should address issues of compensation, benefits, and working conditions for all pre-K teachers. If we want high-quality pre-K, then we need good teachers. We need to be able to create the conditions that make teachers want to stay in pre-K and work with the children and families who stand to gain much from their expertise. So without a doubt, I think this is an exciting time for young children in the U.S. and certainly in Michigan. States and districts are increasingly investing in making early learning opportunities available to larger numbers of children. Pre-K partnerships are a particularly promising aspect of this effort because they have the potential to create strong linkages between public schools and early childhood providers. Yet, as I've just described in this talk, when pre-K comes to school, there are unintended costs and consequences for the institutions and teachers who implement pre-K policy. If pre-K partnerships are to serve young children effectively, they must be guided by policies that are informed by and respond to local realities. Thank you.